half-human spawn, freaks that mothers fear, the nighttime growls of wolves heard within city walls, beasts that speak to the shocked herdsman, the hard rain that falls, the menacing storm cloud turned red with blood, the water wells turned to gore, the moons that clash into the heavens and the twin suns. These things no longer shock the world, for all such portents are nothing compared to this, a Eunuch Consul. Alas, the shame of earth and sky, this hag dressed in finery, paraded through the cities, emasculates with his name the year. So begins Book I of In Eutropium, or Against Eutropius, a sensationalist invective against the Eunuch Consul of the Eastern Roman Empire, Eutropius, written at the end of the 4th century AD by the poet Claudianus, or Claudian as he is known to his pals. In this video, which will be the first of several, we'll take a look at this poem, its characters and contexts, with readings from all the best bits in all their sensationalist, shocking glory. Welcome to Ancient Classics. The poet Claudian was probably born in Alexandria, Egypt, around 370 AD. In his 20s, he moved to Italy, where he somehow ingratiated himself in the court of the Western Roman Emperor. By this time, the 390s AD, the Roman Empire had pretty much split into two halves. The east was administered from Byzantium or Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The administrative centre of the west half of the empire had moved from Rome to Milan about a century earlier, but was soon to move to Ravenna. The division of the empire did not happen overnight. Things had been going that way, I guess, ever since the Emperor Constantine formally founded Constantinople as a new Rome in 324 AD or thereabouts. But one might argue that the poem that we're considering in this video, which was probably written in or around 399, marked the point at which the division of the eastern and western halves of the empire was irrevocable, as Christiansen has argued in his paper Claudian and the East. Our poet Claudian made a name for himself writing in Latin. As a native Alexandrian, one might presume that Greek was his mother tongue, composing encomia, or sycophantic propaganda poems, if you will, for the Western Emperor Honorius and his main man Stilicho, and biting invectives against their rivals, including Eutropius, the subject or target of this poem. So who was this Eutropius? He was a eunuch who somehow had become a powerful figure in the court of the Eastern Roman Emperor at the time, Arcadius, serving as a consul in AD 399, the first and I think only eunuch consul. Now, the concept of having a eunuch occupy such high office was abhorrent and offensive to Roman ideals of masculinity, as the horrific portents that, according to Claudian, were alleged to have heralded his appointment, and with which this poem and this video opened attest. But what was Eutropius's origin story? How did he lose his testicles and gain such power? Our only source for his earlier life and career is Claudian's poem itself, which is pure hyperbolic invective and slander, so we can't take a word of it quite seriously, but it is all the more fun for it. So let's get back to Claudian's poem, skipping to line 44. The eunuch's origin story. From his cradle, he is doomed to bloody torment, snatched away from the womb to be castrated, and punishing miseries ensue after his birth. An Armenian, skilled in the arts of emasculation, sets to work at his genitals with a sharp blade, so as to enhance the baby's unspeakable market value. He drains out the body's fertile juices from their dual locations, and with one cut deprives the baby of the function of father and the name of husband. And so there the child lay, barely alive, his mutilated sinews insinuating an iciness into the depth of his soul. Now, are we to praise the hand that deprived our enemy of his virility, or rather should we blame fate for this origin story? It would have been in our interests for him to have remained a man, he ended up better off for his shame, and he'd still be a slave if only he had retained his manly vigour. There's a lot to be said about this quite horrific passage, describing how Eutropius was castrated at birth and ending with Claudian's sobering thought that though he could celebrate the mutilation of his patron's enemy, Eutropius' castration might well have been the originating cause of his rise to power and notoriety. First, let's think of the historical context. It was an Armenian who castrated baby Eutropius, on Claudian's telling at least. Of course, we can't say that this was necessarily true, nor can we infer, as some do, that Eutropius must too have been Armenian by birth, but it sets the scene as somewhere on the outer eastern reaches of or beyond the empire. This tracks with the notion of eunuchs as an eastern other. As Keith Hopkins noted in a couple of important papers on the role of eunuchs in the Roman Empire, eunuchs were primarily associated with the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire, and indeed the presence of eunuchs in the Ottoman courts in early modern periods might have been an inheritance or continuation from the Byzantine courts. Now, eunuchs also featured occasionally in Roman life from the golden age of the late Republic, and actually before, Terence's play The Eunuch, for example. But they are almost always treated as exotic, slave-like, often Eastern, and almost always marginal figures, othered, to use that annoying postmodern phrase, much like the Galli, the castrated priests of Cybele. There were no homegrown eunuchs from the Western Roman heartland, at least that's perhaps what the Romans would have liked to have told themselves, but who really knows what would have gone on in Roman society's underbelly, because we know full well how atrocities against children can occur right under polite society's nose, right? But I'm digressing. The fact is that Claudian clearly presents Eutropius here as an idiosyncratically Eastern threat and an Eastern phenomenon, which perhaps also plays into the idea expressed by Christiansen, as I mentioned earlier, that one could see this poem as emblematic of the defining period at which the Western and the Eastern Roman empires really became permanently divided. Whatever one makes of the historical context, it's pretty clear that this passage is disturbing. Now, much of this poem is humorous and deliberately scandalous in its over-the-top hyperbole, a bit of a schlockfest, but this passage, the sheer horror of the brutality meted out on an innocent baby, makes me feel distinctly uncomfortable, almost ashamed of otherwise purulently leering along with Claudian at the cartoonish villain of the piece. And this passage, though, forces us to confront the fact that Eutropius was once an innocent victim. And that's the thing. We can't vouch for or rely on anything that Claudian tells us in this poem, apart from the broadest of details. Was Eutropius the perverted monster that Claudian makes him out to be? Possibly, but equally possibly not. This whole poem might just be one massive libel. But we can trust with almost absolute certainty the core truth of this particular scene. For regardless of all else, Eutropius was once an innocent baby, one who suffered the most terrible and tragic of crimes against him. It seems almost as if even Claudian for a second acknowledges this too, and with that realization one has to also acknowledge that this poem is a little bit distasteful. One long instance perhaps of punching down, as the wokies might say. But hell, that's enough wokery for now. Let's put all that aside and just enjoy the poem without self-flagellating ourselves over it. But before moving on, it's worth noting the profit motive of the Armenian castrator that is specifically called out by Claudian here. It's noted that he mutilated baby Eutropius specifically to increase his market value. It's a terrible thought, but at least we can be grateful that there's no industry today that seeks to profit from the castration of young people. Claudian next describes how Eutropius was sold in the slave markets of Assyria, trafficked and bought and sold multiple times, a child sex slave no less. Yeah, it's also grim, and despite Claudian Claudian's slanderous agenda, I'm guessing this is also probably not too far from the truth of what actually happened, and certainly what happened to many people like Eutropius. Eventually, Eutropius finds himself the catamite of some kind of public servant or official called Ptolemy. But eventually, Eutropius ages out of the role, and Ptolemy gifts Eutropius to a guy called Aranthius as a freebie for sloppy seconds. His abandonment by Ptolemy, which Claudian snarkily calls a divortia, prompts the following lament from Eutropius. Alas, so this is what you call fidelity. Ptolemy, is this my reward for all the time spent in your embrace, the marriage bed, and all those nights we spent together shacked up in some cheap dive? Have I been denied the liberty that was promised to me? Or are you leaving Eutropius as a widow, you cruel man? Our nights together consigned to oblivion. The cruelest fate is reserved for the likes of me. When a woman grows old, she maintains her marital status as a mother. The dignity of motherhood weighs favourably against the prettiness of a bride. But the fertility goddess Lucina shuns me. I have no child on which to depend. Love has left me, along with my beauty. My pretty cheeks are ravished. With what skills can I save my own skin? By what means shall I, an old man, be of use to anyone? The abandoned Eutropius's lament is clearly parodying and perverting a classic epic-adjacent trope, the lament of a heroine deserted by her legendary but cruel lover. The two most famous examples of this trope are Ariadne's lament from Catullus 64, when the Cretan heroine Ariadne laments her desertion by Theseus on the island of Naxos, and, of course, the lament of Dido from Book 4 of Virgil's Aeneid. Now, when I first read this speech, I laughed out loud because the allusions were immediately clear to me. I found it so funny to see the tropes of a beautiful, deserted epic heroine twisted and repurposed for this washed-out, scruffy, pock-scarred catamite. And here I'm minded to recall a description from earlier in the poem, which I've omitted thus far. By this time, Eutropius had become a deformed cadaver. His whole body had gone all saggy, like a hag's wrinkles. Once again, Claudian's cruel invective has perhaps more than a grain of truth, or at least it seems drawn from real-life observations of eunuchs and the physical deteriorations they face when they age out. Again, that's the thing with this poem. When I read it, I constantly seesaw between amusement and also a deep sense of unease over the cruel realities that were inflicted on so many people, which Claudian himself seems to acknowledge. But back to the quasi-epic allusion, the parodying and perversion of an epic heroine's lament. Jacqueline Long, in her monograph, How, When and Why to Slander a Eunuch, great title, catalogues the models for this kind of trope, but also its other parodies, drawing parallels to another gay abandonment scene in Petronius' Satyricon. So perhaps by Claudian's time, this repurposing of the trope had already become somewhat trite, though to be fair to Claudian, I reminded myself of the scene in Petronius that Long refers to, and I don't think it was actually that similar to this passage at all. But anyway, sometimes academics find allusions in places where they don't really actually exist. Anyway, we'll continue our survey of Eutropius' early career as presented by Claudian next time. But in case anyone's worried about our anti-hero's progress after his tragic dumping, I'll put you all out your misery, for next he gets a job as a pimp. And if Claudian is to be believed, he's exceptionally good at his new profession. So things are maybe finally looking up for our poor old Eutropius. But we'll cover that next time. Meantime, like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon.